As she walked away, the officer was left standing there, paralyzed with uncertainty. There was no simple solution anymore. His mistake, her power play, and now this revelation about corruption. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't even begin to solve. The brief recess was supposed to be a chance for everyone to cool off, but for the officer, it was the beginning of a terrifying realization. Whatever happened next, he wasn't just fighting for his job. He was caught in the middle of something much larger than he had ever known. The officer barely noticed the time slipping by as he stood in the back of the courtroom, his mind reeling from everything Rachel had said. The recess was almost over, and he knew he had to face what was coming next. But the unease gnawing at him wouldn't let up. Whatever this was, whatever game Rachel was playing, he was tangled in it now, and he had no way of seeing the whole picture. When the doors to the courtroom opened again, the tension returned like a wave. The judge's stern voice called the room to order, and the officer took his place at the front, feeling the weight of the room's eyes on him. His thoughts were still racing, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was unfolding. Rachel's words kept echoing in his mind. This was a message. What was she trying to say? And why had she gone so far to expose him? The room quieted as the proceedings resumed. Rachel sat, her expression calm, but there was a shift in her demeanor. It was subtle, but the officer could see it. She wasn't here just to make him pay for his mistake. She was ready for something more. The judge looked at both parties, his gaze shifting from the officer to Rachel. "I trust we're ready to proceed." His voice was cold, but there was a hint of something else in it now. Curiosity, maybe, or concern. The officer's mind raced again as he looked over at Rachel, who met his eyes without flinching. She wasn't the person he had arrested just hours ago. She was a completely different force now. The prosecutor stood, her voice carrying with a quiet confidence that made every word feel calculated. "Your Honor, after further review of the arrest, we've discovered that not only was there no warrant issued, but the officer had been misled by internal records that were tampered with." The officer's heart nearly stopped. Asterisk tampered with, asterisk, his mind reeled with the implications. Was Rachel accusing someone else of framing him? Could there be a conspiracy at play? But Rachel wasn't finished. She turned her gaze toward the officer, and for the first time, there was something else in her eyes, something dark and knowing. "This isn't about one arrest, Officer Hayes. This is about a much bigger picture, something that's been brewing in the department for months. And you, standing here, are the only one who doesn't know it yet." A shiver ran down the officer's spine as the realization hit him. This had never been about him making a mistake. It had been about him being placed at the center of a much larger operation. The arrest, the paperwork, the clerical error. It had all been set in motion by someone else. Someone powerful within the department, and Rachel had been pulling the strings the entire time. But just as he thought he understood, Rachel turned to the judge, her voice cold. "I'm withdrawing all charges against Officer Hayes. But," she added, "I need to make something clear. This is not the end. This is just the beginning of what will happen next." The officer stood frozen, his mind spinning. He had expected this to be the end of his career, maybe even the end of his life as he knew it. But instead, Rachel had just set the stage for something far more dangerous. She wasn't finished with him, or with the system. And as the courtroom began to empty, the officer felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to face a shadowy figure standing behind him. It was a colleague from his department, someone he'd trusted for years. "You should have known," the colleague whispered, his voice low. "This wasn't about you. It was about them." With that, the officer turned to see Rachel standing by the door, a knowing smile on her face. He had just learned that he wasn't the one in control anymore. And now, in a cruel twist, he was left wondering who exactly was playing whom. As the courtroom emptied, the officer's world crumbled around him, and he realized with a sinking heart that the story was far from over. This was just the beginning of something far darker, and he was in deeper than ever before. As the last of the spectators filtered out of the courtroom, the officer stood frozen, trying to make sense of everything. Rachel's cryptic words echoed in his mind. Asterisk, this is just the beginning asterisk. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize or defend himself, but no words came out. Rachel was not finished. She stood up now, her gaze never leaving his, and turned toward the judge. The room was hanging on every word she was about to say. "Your Honor," she said, her voice growing colder, "this officer made a grave error. But what's more concerning is that it was a mistake that could have been avoided if proper procedures were followed. This isn't just about one wrongful arrest. This speaks to the failures in the system that we continue to turn a blind eye to." Rachel's words hit like a hammer, and the officer felt the weight of them crushing him. It wasn't just about his mistake anymore. It was bigger than that. His face flushed as he realized the implications of what she was saying. Was this an attack on the department he worked for? Was she trying to expose deeper flaws in the system, using him as the example? As she spoke, a chill ran down the officer's spine. The entire room seemed to be waiting for something, some kind of action, some kind of decision that would determine where all this was going. The room was split, each person silently choosing a side in their minds, but none of them spoke. Rachel's words hung in the air like a bomb about to go off, and the officer's heart was hammering in his chest as the weight of the situation settled in. Then, before he could even begin to process what was happening, she turned back to face him. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, something sharp, almost predatory, and the officer knew that this was far from over. The questions burned in his mind. Was Rachel truly going to make him pay for his mistake? Or was there something else going on here, something deep that he couldn't yet understand? The next few moments could change everything for him, and the suspense was unbearable. Just as the officer felt like the room would explode from the pressure, the judge spoke again, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "We will adjourn for a brief recess. This will need to be carefully examined." The gavel slammed once again, but this time it barely registered. The officer stood there, barely able to breathe as the judge's words echoed in his head. The tension in the room didn't ease as the court was adjourned for the recess. People shuffled in their seats, but none of them moved fast enough for the officer. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the whispers that followed him as he made his way to the back of the courtroom. His mind raced, caught between dread and disbelief. Had he really arrested the state's top prosecutor over a clerical error? And what was Rachel's true game here? He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than he understood. He wasn't just facing a potential career-ending mistake. Something about this felt orchestrated, deliberate. As he leaned against the cold wall, trying to collect his thoughts, he heard the soft click of footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting one of the clerks or a fellow officer. Instead, it was Rachel. She stood just a few feet away, her posture relaxed, but every inch of her presence felt like it was filling the room. She was no longer in prosecutor mode. She was something else entirely. "You know," she began, her voice low but unmistakably pointed, "this could have all been avoided if you had just listened." The officer froze, his stomach sinking. There it was again, asterisk listen asterisk. It was the same thing she'd said in the car before the arrest. He felt a strange knot form in his gut. She knew something. She was playing him, but what for? Rachel stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You've been part of something much bigger than you think. And now you've stumbled into a situation where your choice might change everything for both of us." She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air before continuing, "I've been watching you." The officer blinked, stunned by the admission. "Watching me?" he asked, his voice betraying his confusion. Rachel gave a faint smile, almost sad. "Not just you, everything. The system, the corruption that's been rotting it from the inside out. You and your department, you're not innocent in this, and neither am I." The officer's mind struggled to process what she was implying. Asterisk corruption asterisk. It didn't make sense. How could the very prosecutor who had built a reputation on punishing criminals be tangled in something like this? What kind of game was she playing? Before he could ask another question, Rachel turned, her movements precise and deliberate. "You're not the only one who has made mistakes today," she said without looking back. "I'll let you in on a little secret. This arrest wasn't an accident. It was an asterisk message asterisk." A chill swept through him. What did she mean by that? Was she saying that this whole situation had been orchestrated from the beginning? Was it all a setup to expose something even darker than he could imagine? He had expected the usual court proceedings, not this. He wasn't prepared to face the woman he had arrested, especially not in this setting. He glanced around the room, hoping for some sort of rescue, but the eyes of everyone present were locked on him. The judge, a stern man with decades of experience, looked at him expectantly. The other lawyers, the clerks, even the bailiffs, seemed to be waiting for his next move. Rachel, however, remained calm. She sat there, poised and confident, her gaze never leaving the officer. Her expression betrayed nothing, no anger, no frustration, just a quiet intensity. It was almost as if she was daring him to make the next move, forcing him to face the consequences of his actions. But the officer had no clue what those consequences might be. Was she going to make an example out of him? Would she press charges for false arrest or even misconduct? Or was this some kind of power play, a way for her to remind everyone who was truly in charge? The officer thought it was just another routine arrest. A woman driving a sleek black sedan had rolled through a stop sign, and when he pulled her over, something about her attitude rubbed him the wrong way. She wasn't flustered or apologetic. She was calm, almost too calm. He asked for her license and registration, and she handed them over without hesitation. But something didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the way she looked at him. Unshaken, confident. It made him suspicious. Determined to take control of the situation, he ran her ID. A name popped up. It was familiar, but he didn't immediately place it. He checked the system, and a minor warrant appeared, probably a clerical error, but a warrant nonetheless. That was all he needed. He ordered her out of the car, placed her in cuffs, and read her rights. She didn't resist, didn't argue. But as she sat in the back of his patrol car, she said just one thing: "You might want to double-check that." The officer ignored her. He had done his job. A warrant was a warrant. He drove her to the station, filed the paperwork, and called it a day. But what he didn't know, what he failed to check, was who she really was. Days later, he walked into the courtroom, confident as ever. He had made countless arrests before. This was no different. But as he stepped inside, his stomach dropped. Sitting at the prosecutor's table, staring straight at him, was the woman he had arrested. Only this time she wasn't in handcuffs. She wasn't the defendant. She was the state's chief prosecutor, the highest-ranking legal authority in the entire courtroom. For the first time in his career, the officer felt his confidence slip. His mouth went dry. His hands turned cold, because now the tables had turned, and he was about to find out just how big of a mistake he had made. What happens next? Stay tuned. The colleague who had whispered those final words to him disappeared into the hallway, leaving the officer alone with his thoughts. He walked to the door, his mind heavy with the realization that nothing was as it seemed. Rachel Martinez had known exactly what she was doing. She had used him, but for what? To expose a corruption network that ran deep within the system. To remind him, and everyone else, who had the real power. Outside the courthouse, the officer took a deep breath of the cool air, his thoughts still a whirlwind. What would happen now? Would Rachel follow through with her plan? Would the system change? Or was this just a way to consolidate more power, hidden behind the guise of justice? Days passed, and the officer tried to return to his usual routine, but something was different. He couldn't shake the feeling that the events of that day had only scratched the surface of a much darker truth. He began noticing small shifts in the department, quiet whispers in the hallways, officers looking at him with new eyes, as if they too had seen something he hadn't. One evening, as he sat at his desk, a letter appeared on top of his paperwork. It was from Rachel. With a steady hand, he opened it, and inside, a simple message. Asterisk, the game's just begun. Watch your back, asterisk. The officer sat back, the chilling truth finally dawning on him. He wasn't free. He never had been. The system, the corruption, Rachel's involvement, it was all tied together. He was now part of something bigger than himself, and no matter how much he wanted to escape, he couldn't. The story, it seemed, was far from over.